Tundra Media presents The Mayor Helps, with the Mayor of Victoria, British Columbia, Lisa Helps. Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's
Victoria
show.
Businesses to know that we're working.
And now, here's your host, from beautiful Victoria, British Columbia, Dave Hatt.
Welcome back to episode 3 of The Mayor Helps, the podcast that connects the Mayor of Victoria, Lisa Helps, to community and business leaders coast to coast for the express purpose of sharing ideas and solutions to forge a better tomorrow. Later in the show, the Mayor chats with Mary Rowe, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. And during our question and answer period, she will take questions from a couple of local business owners. Good morning, Mayor Helps. How are you doing today?
I'm well, Dave. Good morning.
So big week for land acquisition for the city. City of Victoria has become landowners of a brand spanking new plot of land, $9.59 million on Pandora.
Yeah, that's right. The purchase and the whole process has been in play for some time. It wasn't in response to anything that's happening right now. It was a long-term deal that the city had been working on. It's a strategic acquisition in the middle of downtown, and we'll share more about what we're going to do when we've got some plans. It's definitely exciting.
So is that last episode 2, we discussed and you discussed explicitly about the local community pooling together money with the province and the feds. Is that one of the initial expenses with that?
No, this is a separate acquisition by the city. That program that we were talking about last time is the Regional Housing First program, and that's the regional government as a whole, so the Capital Regional District with the feds and the province. And interestingly, there are about 900 units underway right now through that project, and only I think 82 of them are in Victoria. The rest are in Langford, View Royal, Suusa. So it's great to see affordable housing being built throughout the region. So no, this was a separate purchase by the city for strategic purposes.
Could you explain a little bit, open the doors in terms of what the thought process that goes behind buying that particular chunk of land? I know from driving by it every day, it's sort of in homeless row, if that is a phrase, but that's where most of the homeless people in the city are situated. So is that why you decided to, or the city, I should say, decided to go after that section of land?
It's been a site that's been derelict for as long as I can remember. I don't even remember when the automobile businesses that used to be there closed. I know it had served actually as campaign offices for some candidates some years back. So it's been vacant for some time. Land is hard to come by in the downtown of any city, but particularly a city as small as Victoria. So when the opportunity came available, it seemed like a strategic purchase for the city to be a key landholder in the downtown.
Okay, so now the second point that I wanted to get at was we've got an area in the city called Beacon Hill Park, and it's a fairly popular tourist destination. It's very close to the water. There's a petting zoo. There's beautiful gardens. By its name, there's a hill lookout. You can look across the Juan de Fuca Strait. You can see the Olympic Mountains in the States. Lots of parking in there. Mostly I've seen it and I've experienced it, when my folks would come to town from Edmonton or my wife's parents would come, we'd drive down there, park there. Now, there hasn't been parking allowed in the park because of COVID, social distancing. Now, I read that there's a possibility that the parking could be eliminated for a longer term. Is the thought interim, long term, meaning, till COVID, we have a real handle on it, or is the thought actually, get rid of parking altogether down there?
We'll see. So the proposal right now, the park has been closed to cars and open to pedestrians and cyclists on weekends. When Bonnie Henry said that outside is better and people needed more space to be outside, we made more space in the park over the weekends. And now with the summer coming and more people feeling safer coming out of their homes, we know that there are going to be more people in the park. So the proposal that's coming to council tomorrow is to keep the park open to pedestrians and cyclists only, for the summer, receive input and feedback and see how that goes, and then reassess at the end of the summer. But we are planning to keep the large parking lot right by the petting zoo open, so people will be able to come in their cars, drive into the park, and park in that parking lot. As well, there are between 300 and 400 spots all around the park. So another very popular area at Beacon Hill Park is the playground on Cook Street, and there's ample street parking right adjacent to that playground. So not the playgrounds are quite open yet. I don't want people to rushing out to play. We haven't figured that one out yet. So yeah, that's the thinking. We'll do it for the summer. We'll see how it goes. Keep the parking lot open near the petting zoo, which is the main parking lot, so people can access by vehicle, but keep the space within the park for pedestrians and cyclists.
Great, thank you. Is there anything else you want to add during this State of the Union sort of segment?
Well, I think it's an exciting time right now for cities across the country. Here in BC, we've gotten the green light from the province that we can slowly, cautiously, and carefully begin to reopen, to poke our heads up. And what we are going to be doing tomorrow at City Hall is thinking about all of the ways that council and staff can support residents and businesses through the recovery period. As the Premier said in his address last Wednesday, if businesses reopen and no one comes, that's not a success. And so we need to think about what we can do as a local government to make it safe for people to be out and about, to have those physical distances, to make more space for retailers and restaurateurs. So that's our commitment, and that's our work here at City Hall for the next 3 to 4 weeks, is figure out what we can do to enable the conditions for businesses to reopen successfully, and their loving and loyal customers to feel safe in public spaces and in those businesses.
Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's show.
Now's the time for the podcast where we do our question and answer period. And our first question comes from Suusa Kim from Poppet Creative. Suusa, meet Mayor Helps and ask away.
Good morning, Mayor Helps. It's
Good
good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
First of all, I just wanted to really extend my appreciation for all of the advocacy that you've been doing for small business and the art community, especially. I saw yesterday about the poet laureate, the youth poet laureate, and I thought that was so great to see. And one of my questions was about bylaws, and if you can see any easing of different bylaws, like the use of sidewalk space in front of retail stores, or and any others that you can see as being helpful during this in between time, or whatever time we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. So this Thursday, tomorrow, I've asked council to bring forward all sorts of ideas about what we can do to help residents and business owners through the recovery period. And it's really interesting. I didn't ask people to really coordinate or get organized, but there are at least 3 motions coming forward, one from myself and Councillor Loveday, one from Councillor Young, and one from Councillors Thornton Joe and Alto, all talking about changing bylaws to allow retailers and restaurateurs to use public spaces a little bit differently during the recovery period. So the answer is yes. And I wrote an op-ed in the paper on Sunday, and I wanted to signal to everybody that this wasn't something that could take 6 or 8 months. Sometimes changing bylaws takes a long time, and I think we need to approach recovery with the same spirit that, if we can shut down City Hall and get everybody working at home within 3 weeks, then certainly we can figure out within 3 weeks how to get our retailers and restaurateurs out there in public spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Fabulous question. Thank you, Suusa. Appreciate it. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Second guest in our question and answer is Audrey Graham, and she's a partner in Pit Stop Bikes, which is a local bike repair shop. Audrey, meet Mayor Helps and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, good morning, Mayor Helps.
Good morning.
So everybody I talk to is really concerned about the homelessness and addiction in the city. And it feels a little kind of hopeless, I'm wondering what you think we can do on a more personal level as individuals in our own life, even just to take a different mindset towards it, or how individuals can help ease the problem. And I'm also wondering if there are cities that have, overcome or don't suffer so much from these problems, and if they have common elements of design or community that you think might be inspirational for us.
Those are both great questions. In terms of what people can do, I think sometimes, and I'm so glad you asked about changing mindsets, there's this fantastic local project. It's called the Existence Project. And it's a guy who started it 4 years ago, and his name is Marco. And he works with people who are homeless and helps them tell their story in their own words, and walks them through a workshop, kind of a 4-section workshop to do that. And then there's a podcast, and he's also started during COVID, I guess it's some kind of Facebook Live called Up Close, where he talks with people who are working on the front lines of homelessness. So I think the Existence Project, and it's obviously free and open to everybody. If you Google it and share it, that's a really powerful way to learn through story about what we can do and how we can understand differently. So that's what I would recommend in that respect. In terms of other cities that are doing a good job, I think that there isn't any city in Canada that's really cracked this yet, because it's really complex. And well, in some ways it's complex, in some ways it's simple. It's complex in galvanizing the resources, but once the resources for mental health supports and housing, healthcare are there, we see transformation in people's lives. And I'm actually quite optimistic right now with the provincial government's program. I don't know if you've seen that there are 360 people living outside in Topaz Park and on Pandora, and the province has committed to housing all of those folks with the healthcare supports, the mental health and addiction supports that they need to be successful for the long term. So that's a big pilot project, 360 people, but I think there are going to be a lot of learnings from that about what we need to do going forward. So it does feel very hopeless at times, but with the Existence Project kind of getting a different way of looking at it out there, and with the province's leadership right now during COVID, I'm more optimistic than I have been in a long time.
Oh, good.
And another point that I can raise, Audrey, is episode 2 of The Mayor Helps, which I'll send you a link, was entirely focused on the homelessness issue. We had a very good discussion on it. And as a small business owner, I'd raised with the mayor the concern of people breaking into my shop. And I know that your partner Guillermo has mentioned the same thing. And so we did touch on it. We were able to address it. Obviously, as the mayor said, it's more complicated than a simple solution, but there was a lot of good information. So I'll share that with you.
Nice to meet you, Audrey.
Thanks, Audrey. Take care. Good to see you.
Bye.
Have your say. Send your questions and comments to themayorhelps.com. They could be included in next week's show. And now, Mayor Lisa Help sits down with this week's special guest.
Today's guest is Mary Rowe, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute. Mary is an urban advocate and civil society leader. Welcome to the Mayor Helps podcast, Mary.
Thanks for having me. Delighted.
So you've worked extensively in New York, New Orleans, and now Toronto. You were part of the boots on the ground team that helped rebuild New York after Hurricane Sandy and New Orleans after Katrina. Is that correct?
Correct.
So one of the questions that the mayor wanted us to ask you about, how has that influenced or impacted your approach to COVID-19?
Well, I think it's over. I wouldn't say I was part of Boots on the Ground. I was a supporter of Boots on the Ground. In both cases, I moved to New Orleans after Katrina because I was working on trying to understand how self-organization functions in cities. This was a project I had started, which began the day that the levees broke, and I was in Virginia actually at that point, and realized the foundation that was supporting that work had derived its endowment, its wealth from the Gulf Coast. So they said, you have to make New Orleans part of your inquiry. And I didn't really even know where New Orleans was. I was like everybody else. I'd watched on CNN over the weekend people being on roofs of houses waiting to be rescued. And I so then they said, you have to make New Orleans part of what you're trying to understand. And so I managed to make my way down there, but it was a very chaotic environment. And this is really before social media. People don't realize 15 years ago, we didn't have the kind of ubiquitous kind of contact that we can have digitally. It was very unfamiliar then. And so just actually getting information about what was actually happening in New Orleans or along the Gulf Coast was very difficult. And eventually I was able to navigate my way there, and then ended up living there and supporting a bunch of what I would suggest are sort of organic, local responses to the experience there. And that's where I think it was a life-changing thing for me. It was a seminal experience, because what I watched locals recognize is that no cavalry was coming. I've quoted Karen Gadbois, who was an artist who became a blogger and then became an investigative journalist and has gone on to win all sorts of awards. This was a textile artist who'd never really used a computer. And she, just by paying attention to what she was noticing in her neighborhood, she then became the voice of paying attention to what I would call the particular, and seeing that locals actually observe things at a ground level at a way that no policymaker at a far distance can observe. And I just was shaken into the awareness that you want to be creating conditions, enabling conditions for local responses to emerge and then be resourced so that they can take hold and really solve problems. And she used this phrase, that they kept thinking, any day now, they thought the cavalry was going to come over the hill. And they kept waiting and they kept waiting. And then they finally came to this realization that we were the ones that we've been waiting for, or that they were the ones that they'd been waiting for. And it was just a moment that I came to appreciate this. And then when I moved to New York after Katrina and happened to be there during Hurricane Sandy, the same kind of thing was manifest in front of me, that, and we're seeing it now for COVID, that you need to mobilize all sorts of resources. These are all hands on deck moments, but what you always need to be, I feel, watching carefully for is what's going on in particular neighborhoods and what are the improvisations that people are making up and figuring out to be responsive to whatever the particular local challenge is. And that's why you're seeing the federal government here they make big announcements about relief programs or things that they want to try to support, but then it takes a few weeks to shake out, well, actually, how will this work on the ground? And I think that's one of the learnings here, is that resilience is fundamentally community-based, and it emerges out of local experience, if it's going to stick, if it's really going to work. And then the question is, you go from that very particular experience, and then you see if you can level that up to create the kind of repository of resources you need to get these things at a scale that we need them. But that's quite different from trying to armchair quarterback. And we saw it during Katrina, there was the White House really unable to make a contribution that was useful because it was just too far away from the real challenge that we were seeing on the ground. And we have that now at a scale that's just unfathomable at every local community around the world.
Yeah, I've seen it, not when you paint the picture, I've seen it repeatedly in my lifetime. Things like fisheries in Newfoundland, where Ottawa was out of touch, and certainly living in Victoria. I lived in Toronto for 10 years, and then coming to Victoria, I used to work in the advertising industry, and they would say about the island, we'll do a national ad campaign for everywhere, but the island's different. But how that manifests is that it is different. It's a very small community. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor, but what you face, the challenges you face, are certainly significantly different than what they face on a larger government, a more national or provincial government, even for that matter.
Absolutely. I think Mary's bang on, and she and I have talked about this before. And if you ask any mayor, and it'll be very interesting, kind of a mayor's post-mortem on COVID, what are the things that we've had to deal with, and what are the resources that we've mobilized? Mary speaks to the federal government programs, and yesterday's announcement for funding for seniors is a great example. There's $20 million that's going to be coming through a New Horizons Foundation to seniors organizations. And I think that's awesome. When that money trickles into our community, probably be $100,000 or $200,000 that actually makes its way to Victoria, that's going to have a profound impact. And so I think the federal government's very wise in making these announcements and getting the money out into the hands of community. Because it's cities that are, I would say, leading the recovery, and not city governments, but city city citizens, city residents, and like yourself, Dave, and others, small business owners that have really stepped up to figure out how do we come together and how do we recreate some sense of normal.
It's interesting, running a national organization and with a federated model of Canada, and having this understanding that you and I have, Mayor Helps, that really what you want to do is you want to get resources to the most local delivery agent that you can. There's this very fancy principle called subsidiarity, which is really something that's talked about in Europe more, and we've talked about it somewhat in Canada, that you want to see the level of government closest to the recipient of the service to be the one that delivers, designs, implements, and resources that service. You don't want a disconnection between me as a citizen or a resident receiving a service. I need to know who it is who's responsible for delivering that service and how is it resourced, so that if it's not right, I then have one place to go to hold them accountable and say if you're not delivering it correctly or it's designed improperly. The dilemma we've got in Canada is that those services are often really layered up. And so it might be a provincially delivered service that's actually municipally implemented, and then it's federally funded, and then there's a blend. It's very difficult. It's complicated, and it's complex, both. And so I'm not suggesting you can make it really simple. But when you look at a crisis like this, and you recognize that the first line of defense, the first response is a municipal government and a municipal agency or municipal authority of some kind. And it's not like they're spending a lot of time saying, we don't have the resources to provide that immediate need, or gee, we're going to have to think about whether that's in our jurisdiction. I mean, municipal governments and their partners, as Lisa just suggested, have had to just step in, roll up sleeves, and figure it out. And now they're in a tight spot because they didn't have the right revenue streams before COVID. They were already in situations where they were delivering services that they didn't have adequate revenue streams to deliver. And now they've not spent 10 seconds wondering whether they should do something. They've had to actually improvise and step in and do it. And I think it's going to require a real reshake-up, a rethinking and a shake-up of how we distribute resources, how we identify policy priorities, and how do you vest more capacity in the local deliverers and it should be designers of programs and policies to make urban environments work.
Well, it seems like the Canadian Urban Institute, of which you're president and CEO, has been leading the way and in building 2 websites recently, City Watch and City Share. It's very interesting when I ran across those, because when this whole COVID thing hit, I've got this cleaner, the business fell out, literally just went away. My background is in media, and I've always wanted to get back into it and do something like this. And the concept is to connect disparate communities.
Right.
So in seeing City Watch and City Share, that's what you're doing for this crisis. And then when you combine what you've just said, and then a phrase that you use throughout the literature that I read on you was Main Street. And in my experience, it's a very American phrase, but it's very accurate. It means a bunch of different things to a bunch of different people. Can you explain why you choose explicitly to use the term Main Street when you're referring to helping people on COVID?
Well, it's interesting, before COVID, I've only been in this gig for 4 or 5 months before COVID hit. So crash course. But we had started to suggest that we were in the connective tissue business. And I started to say that when you think of the way that the Confederation model works, Canada is very organized vertically. So a municipal government relates to a provincial government, relates to a federal government, and it's all sort of in that kind of hierarchical level. And then you come in and you say, well, actually, the way that cities actually function, it's a much more horizontal relationship. It's much more of it's not as hierarchical in municipal environments and urban environments as it might have been structured nationally. And remembering that Confederation is, old. So it's based on an old model that was put together when we were primarily an agrarian society. So now I came in and said, well, let's figure out, can we create more horizontal relationships in Canada? They don't have to be formalized even. Just this kind of an ecosystem. People that are younger than me understand this and get this instinctively, that the world is really about a web of connection. Our kids and our grandchildren will see the world as a connected unit like that, and they don't understand the verticality history that we might have. So we created this connective tissue notion, and we went on the assumption that if you actually up the connectivity, this is something I learned in New Orleans, if you up the connectivity amongst agents functioning in an urban environment, then that overall system can course correct. It shares information, it's more nimble, and it can be very responsive and organic. That's how an economy works. That's how economic trade works. I sell to you, you sell to me. I'm going to stop buying from you because I'm going to make it myself, and then my economy grows, and then you buy from me. That's this kind of web of interrelationship we see manifesting in nature, and then it manifests in economies, and then it manifests in cities. So I said, well, let's do that with COI. Let's see if we can build connective tissue. And so when COVID hit, suddenly we were in a situation where we thought, well, shit, we got to build that connective tissue quickly, digitally, so that cities can learn from one another. So we started with City Watch, so that Mayor Helps' office could look and see what's going on in Mayor Savage's office. How is Halifax coping? So that you would learn more quickly, because what was happening is that they had no idea what each other was doing, and it slows the system down. Whereas if you're connected, you say, oh, well, they've tried that, let's try our version, right? And then we added City Share at the same time, because we recognized, as Mayor Helps just acknowledged, that the innovation wouldn't just come from municipal governments. It was going to come from community groups and businesses and Facebook caremongering groups, and it was going to come from communities self-organizing. So we wanted to have those two things in parallel, kind of the big C, formal municipal government, and then the small c, the broader city working. And then as we started to aggregate those up, and if you've looked at it, and it sounds like you have, Dave, I always say to people, whenever you're feeling really discouraged about COVID, just spend 10 minutes on either City Watch or City Share, and you will just be astonished at how responsive and quick and imaginative municipal governments and people and organizations in cities are. You get inspired there. Oh, look how they're doing curbside delivery here. Look how they've been doing support to seniors there. It's astonishing. And we started City Talk, which is this digital platform for people to have conversations, to make sense of things. And again, that's the same thing. We're all learning things. We had the head of the library associations across the country on, including yours, Mayor Helps. We had the Victoria chief librarian, who was fabulous. And one of the people on that call talked about how their librarians had realized that they had a certain chunk of members, card holders that were over 75. They wanted to reach out to them just to check to see if they knew how to use the digital service. And what they found is that the seniors, well, 75-year-olds, were just happy to have a call, just to have a visit. And so their librarians now do that. They just call every week just to have a visit. So, librarians now become caregivers. It's just, so I think this is part of the learning. And so when we were trying to say, well, how do we distill all this incredible stuff we're learning, we thought, what's at the heart of every neighborhood? And what's at the heart of every neighborhood is a main street somewhere. And it's not even necessarily a formal street. It could be a strip mall. It could be a bar. It could be a water, it could be a four corners. In smaller communities, it's often just an intersection. But Main Street became the code, the sort of proxy for, let's look at the aggregation in every local community that brings together commercial interest, retail interest, civic interest. It's a gathering place. It has a mix of independence. It might have a few chains too. It might have a faith institution. It might have a community center. It might have a civic institution like a library, but that everybody can pretty much say where's their place. I suppose we could have called it the main place, bring back main place, but that didn't seem to work. And Main Street is just, it's as you suggest. I appreciate it. I lived in the US for a number of years, and I appreciate that there's this sort of nostalgic kind of, like coming out of 76 Trombones Main Street. But the Main Street now is a much more complex, varied thing. And I think people understand the heart of it, the gist of it. In Quebec, the partner we're working with there, Rue Principale, they talk about their Main Street as the heart of the community. So it allows communities to identify themselves, where's the heart of your community, and how do we bring that back? And we have a sense that business life and commercial life and small business is a really critical piece of that puzzle, we think.
Yeah, I agree. And it's the connectivity and the Main Street thing from my perspective, and the way it always made sense to me. And when we did have a business in California, is I asked a business broker down there, he kept on referring to it as Main Street. And I obviously know what Main Street is ideologically. And he said, no, Main Street businesses, explicitly, he said, the mom and pop shops, the liquor stores, the corner stores, the dry cleaners, the restaurants, the people that own those businesses that live in your community. And so again, it brings back the connectivity. It brings back the community even tighter.
One of the things that, again, as I said, one can overlearn from their history, but I had this extraordinary experience watching New Orleanians navigate this out. And I have an anecdote about this, which is that when I was in New Orleans, Jane Jacobs was still alive. And she and I had a long, well, not that long, actually, only 10 years, but we had a friendship and a professional kind of level of engagement with each other for that period of time. And I would go back periodically to Toronto. And I remember one time I was sitting there just, wringing my hands. What are we going to do about New Orleans? There was all this discourse about you shouldn't bring it back and they should never have built the city there in the first place. And, all this kind of natter. And I was there wringing my hands. What are we going to do about New Orleans? And she just took great exception to me. She turned to me and she said, it's not up to you to do anything about New Orleans. It's about New Orleanians figuring out what they're going to do about New Orleans. And then you just need to help them and support them. And she accused me of thinking like a bureaucrat, which was a pejorative in her mind, in that particular application of it. And it took a long time. It took months and months and months for me to be able to shake her perception that I had somehow turned into some kind of a kind of at arm's length bossy kind of decider, as opposed to letting that community figure it out themselves. It was a very sobering moment for me. And what I found watching, because then I just tried to think, I tried to be much more intentional about observing and paying attention. And what we found was that the larger businesses, the sort of national chains in New Orleans after Katrina took a long time to come back. And in fact, the businesses that came back more quickly were the ones that were locally owned, where the workforce was easily accessible, where the owner had their own skin in the game and wanted to get back to work and wanted to get their workforce back to work. So for instance, the small coffee shops opened far, far earlier than Starbucks did. And the other thing is that the decision-making to reopen stores, big national chains, that decision was being taken, in Atlanta or in LA or New York, wherever the head office was, distant from the community, whereas Joe's coffee shop or Jill's bar, the owner might have even lived upstairs or maybe lived, in a suburb. They might not have lived right downtown, but they made their own decisions. So that's why I keep being very hesitant to join the chorus of folks that are convinced that somehow small mom and pops are going to vanish and big business and big chains are going to come in. I mean, I'm not in any way disputing that the pressure on independent businesses is extraordinary, and that we need, back to Jane putting the fear of God into me, we need to figure out what support needs to be put in place to enable those independent businesses. And there may be new ones too. There will be phoenixes that come out of the ashes, right? And there's all sorts of extraordinary opportunity. And that's a very creative process that needs support and needs enabling conditions. And I think it's incumbent on municipalities to really think carefully about what zoning needs to change. How do they need to make it more amenable to improvisation? So that means different rules on patios and different kinds of approaches to socially distanced use in parks and all the things. Municipal governments they lack a lot of tools, but they also have some that they could make more available or they could help create. And I think, and you as a business owner, Dave, you will know this, that business owners within districts can self-organize too. So my other big hope is that we're going to figure out delivery. Yep. That business owners like you are going to start talking to other business owners in your neighborhoods to figure out if there's a way to do locally owned, locally organized delivery, so that you're not in a situation where you're dependent on these big corporate digital systems that may in fact not end up being able to sustain themselves. And because of the whole issues around whether or not their workers are protected, and lots of customers like me who are now highly suspicious of those centrally controlled delivery services, why not find other ways to create delivery mechanisms that are locally based and where the decisions are being made locally? It's
the speedboat model versus the freighter, for sure. Thank you, Mary. I really appreciate you coming on board, and I think it was a terrific idea for the mayor to have you on.
Can I just say that Mayor Helps is a beacon for municipal, for people watching, for city watchers. And as a municipal leader, I always tease her that Victoria punches above its weight. And we learn so much from cities of all different sizes, but when you have a city like Victoria led by a mayor like Mayor Helps, who's willing to galvanize a real cross-section of stakeholders and do some interesting things, the rest of the country and all the other urban environments benefit from what you're trying. So Mayor Helps, thanks so much. And Dave, thank you for asking me to come on.
Thank you, Mary. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining the Mayor Helps on Tundra Media. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, and subscribe. And visit themayorhelps.com to submit your questions to the show.